After years of barely any compelling first-party Xbox games, cross-gen or otherwise, and the recent Redfall fiasco which led to one of the most defeated interviews in the history of gaming, this feels like a make-or-break moment for Xbox. Now obviously the Xbox brand is not in danger of going extinct. Microsoft has effectively limitless resources, and judging by the exorbitant and grueling acquisition of Activision, they're willing to use them. Instead, it's more of a cultural thing, how the brand is perceived by the public at large. Since Phil Spencer took over last gen and started steering the ship in the right direction, the messaging has been, the games are coming, but it's going to take some time. Well, it's been a long time, and despite all the high-profile studio and publisher acquisitions, it feels like we've yet to truly see the fruits of it all, and the vision for this era of Xbox has still yet to come into focus. What even is Xbox at this point? Game Pass? I couldn't tell you what defines an Xbox game now, and I don't think Microsoft could either. While PS5 has very few true exclusive titles, Xbox Series essentially has none, with Halo Infinite and Forza Horizon 5, both cross-gen, being its biggest titles, and the former performing so badly that it has seemingly put the Halo franchise back into hibernation. Right now, the Series consoles don't even have a game that leverages their tech like Demon's Souls or Ratchet on PS5. Pretty much every Xbox event has been anticipated because people are waiting to see what the payoff is after all these years, and when nothing much happens, it just puts exponentially more pressure onto the next one, but this time it really felt like we reached a precipice. The Redfall drama, the interview, and then the massive question mark which is Starfield, a game whose success or failure is being viewed as a signal for the future of the brand by many. Before we get into this, I wanted to mention that I am not covering every single announcement. I have skipped things that I didn't find interesting, as well as those that I am unqualified to speak on, such as Yakuza or Flight Simulator. Fable is something of a forgotten franchise at this point, and even in its time, it never quite found its footing. From the third game onward, things went completely to hell, and its creator, Peter Molyneux, would go on to become something like the Elizabeth Holmes of the gaming industry. Microsoft apparently still sees value in the brand name, however, and while we have long known about this complete reboot, we've known essentially nothing of it other than the developer, Playground Games. That immediately makes this game of interest. They've been doing outstanding work on the Forza Horizon games, both technically and creatively, and those are also the only games they've ever worked on, making this a complete paradigm shift for the studio. Incredibly, this is using the Forza engine, and it looks amazing. Warm, natural-looking global illumination, rich landscapes with dense geometry, and most impressively for a racing game developer, excellent character models and animation work. The only issue is, I have gained no further understanding of what this game is or even could be. So while it is in-engine footage with what looks like actual third-person gameplay very briefly spliced in, this might as well be a CG trailer with a title reveal. There was also no release date or even window, suggesting that we won't see it for a while, despite it being in production since 2018. EA's infamous 10-year Star Wars game deal with Disney is officially over, and the project they announced back in 2021 with Ubisoft has now finally been revealed as Star Wars Outlaws. In the Xbox event, all we got was a CG trailer and title reveal with some brief details after the show, and it's a prime example of why this type of marketing is such a bad practice. I assumed this thing would be a total snooze fest, and had some brief negative thoughts written up before Ubisoft held their own event and showed 10 minutes of raw gameplay. I still have some of those reservations, but I was very impressed by the gameplay, and it far surpasses what I invented in my head with only a CG trailer and Ubisoft open world to go off of. Just like the Avatar game, which is also looking surprisingly good by the way, this is being made by Massive, the developer behind The Division. It's quite the shakeup for them to be making two licensed games simultaneously, and for both of them to be predominantly single-player. That transition is oddly reminiscent of Respawn's shift from Titanfall to the Star Wars Jedi games, though Respawn had already more than proved themselves with Titanfall 2's phenomenal campaign. I made videos on both Division games, they were not favorable, but the one thing I can say is that Massive is a competent team from a technical perspective, and both Outlaw and Frontiers of Pandora will continue to use their in-house Snowdrop engine, which immediately sets them apart from the sea of Unreal Engine open-world games. Outlaw is an extremely good-looking game, especially considering that it's open world. It's not quite as impressive as Horizon Forbidden West, which I think is the current leader in the genre, but there's no doubt that it is not a cross-gen title. Conceptually, this seems like a spiritual successor to Star Wars 1313, a third-person action shooter where you play as a normal human and interact with the seedy underworld of the Star Wars universe, taking bounties and doing odd jobs. Now, the typical Ubisoft open-world formula is about as revolutionary a format as an advent calendar, but there are a lot of promising gameplay elements here that give me the impression that this is not the typical checklist-style game. With a wanted system and the promise of heists, we're getting some classic GTA elements, and they also seem to have incorporated light RPG mechanics with some dialogue choices that lead to branching narrative paths, as well as a reputation system. The main mission shown here reminded me of something like Insomniac's Spider-Man, where the game is open world, but the mission quality is bespoke and more like a linear game, with its own unique areas. Perhaps the most shocking part of the gameplay reveal was the transition from ground to space, a feature that's lusted over in Star Wars games. There's actual space combat here, and it seems on par with EA's Battlefront 2. There's even a hyperspace jump mechanic, where it seems like you have to avoid damage and debris to travel to your destination. Much like the mythical 1313, this is the type of game that many Star Wars fans have dreamed about, but I do have some issues, and most of them relate to the narrative. I'm not enjoying this main protagonist at all. She was instantly annoying to me with a knockoff Han Solo personality and a Rolodex of MCU quips. The plot also seems a little too reminiscent of the Han Solo movie, though I don't imagine many people remember that film enough to make the connection. But by far the biggest eye roll for me was the inclusion of the Pike Syndicate as the main antagonists for this story. They were most recently used in the comically bad Book of Boba Fett Disney Plus show, and their portrayal here is right in line with that. I do like the era that they chose, though, between Empire and Return of the Jedi. It's a period that is not currently being explored by other Star Wars projects, and presents opportunities for certain known characters to show up. Maybe not Yoda or Luke Skywalker, but definitely Bossk or 4-LOM. I mentioned in my PlayStation Showcase video that Ubisoft outwardly appears to have been struggling these past few years, but something like this is 100% a step in the right direction. And it's such a pleasant surprise that they're letting Massive do these single-player games, instead of forcing them to throw themselves at yet another live service game. This remake of Persona 3, along with the Persona 5 spin-off, was accidentally leaked by Atlus on Instagram of all places prior to the Xbox show. It's still an amazing piece of news though. It's something that I've wanted but assumed was an impossibility since Persona 3 Portable was ported to modern platforms very recently. It looks exactly as you would imagine it and want it to be, which is to say it looks like Persona 5 right down to the stylized UI. There's two interesting things to talk about here. The first is that it is using Unreal Engine, I would assume 4. It's my understanding that Persona 5 uses proprietary tech, and you'd assume that the easy thing to do would be to use P5 as a base framework to make this, but I guess not. I'm very sick of seeing every game and developer switch to Unreal Engine, not just for the uniform look, but for the performance issues that typically follow it. Neither of those are really a concern here given what this game is, but it's a curious decision for sure. The second is that it is launching on PC alongside consoles. Sega and Atlus have expressed their surprise at how well their experiment of PC ports has gone, and now here we are years later with a new release actually launching on PC, something that would have been unthinkable for an Atlus game just a few years ago. For me, it just enhances how excited I am for this game. It means I can play this as a handheld game on the Steam Deck, which it is well suited for, while still being able to play the same save on my PC if I have the ability or desire to play on my TV or desktop. What a time to be alive. I still haven't found the motivation to play the original Hellblade, but there's no doubt that it's impressive from a technical perspective, and I've been keen to see how this sequel pans out as one of the first games to be using Unreal Engine 5. Unfortunately, it's another Fable situation, where we're getting real footage, but it's not really showing the game. This was just a really long cutscene, and for a game that was announced in 2019 and is supposedly releasing next year, I think we need to be seeing what direction the gameplay will take. I have to admit that this cutscene came off as try-hard pretentious to me, but the tech is obviously there, and I do want to see how they're leveraging UE5, if only they would show me. Forza Motorsport finally resurfaced at the Developer Direct a few months back, and what was shown here wasn't all that different from what we already saw. If I'm honest, I'm not really sure why this game exists or what it's trying to do. It's been a long time since we've seen a new motorsport game, and in that time, the arcadey Horizon spin-off brand has kind of usurped it and become the brand. As someone who spends half their day thinking about cars, I'm completely disinterested here. Sure, it fills the same role as GT7, but there's a bigger artistic picture with that game. GT7 is an obsessively made game for people that salivate over the most minor details of cars, with all these totally unnecessary features and modes that celebrate that. It has a very museum-like quality to it. There's a sense of respect and reverence that makes it a deeper experience than just competing with people or NPCs for lap times. Forza Motorsport here just feels like it exists to fulfill the requirement of Xbox having its own up-to-date sim racer, and that's honestly not good enough when Horizon is so compelling. When this game was first announced as simply Forza Motorsport with no number or subtitle, I was under the impression that it would be a game-as-a-service type platform that they would stick with for like a decade and offer as free-to-play. That's not the case though. This is a $70 retail package. I know it's very premature and judgmental to say this, but I think this thing has sales flop written all over it. Obviously, it's on Game Pass, which somewhat makes it that free-to-play platform-like game, but I think this is really going to struggle for attention come this October. Cyberpunk requires no introduction, and I won't belabor the baggage that goes along with it. What I will say is that despite so many claiming that it's a totally different game and completely fixed now, I recently played a few hours of my endgame save to experience the RT Overdrive patch, and found it to still be severely lacking. The path tracing is admittedly very impressive, reminiscent of Crysis 1 in terms of pushing hardware, but this game, man, I'm just not seeing what other people are seeing. I found tons of technical rough edges and visual anomalies. Textures stuck at low LOD and never loading in, as well as numerous NPCs stuck in comical positions. I've recently played other open-world games like the Horizon 2 DLC and Hogwarts, and I'm not seeing stuff like that in those games after 20 hours, but I'm seeing it here after less than 2 hours. It still feels like an early access level of polish in many regards, but beyond that, there are deeper issues with the core game design. The combat and enemy programming are still a joke in my opinion, the world is very look but don't touch, and I find the quests and dialogue to be underwhelming for what is supposed to be a hardcore RPG. That's exactly why I've taken an interest in this first and allegedly only expansion for 2077, as it is being paired with the largest patch the game has seen yet, which promises to significantly overhaul core design features of the game. The way clothing and armor works is changing, they're adding vehicle combat, overhauling skills and perks as well as adding new ones, and there's even a proper police system, so they'll no longer materialize behind you. In some ways, it feels like a relaunch of the game, and this expansion itself echoes that, as the narrative seems to take place far before the end of the original game's main quest. This game is never going to be the dream that was shown in 2018, but it can at least be something passable, something decent, and with the more constrained approach they're taking with Phantom Liberty, I don't doubt that it could be. The setting is very apocalyptic, intentionally avoiding that super dense, living city setting that they fell flat on their faces trying to achieve with the base game. I think the story premise is solid, and Idris Elba is a great choice of actor to feature prominently along with Keanu Reeves' reprisal as Johnny Silverhand, which was one of the very few highlights of the base game for me. It's confirmed as a September release, which is much sooner than I was expecting based on how silent they've been, but I take it as a sign of confidence, since they have surely learned their lesson when it comes to shipping games too early. I'm actually thinking of reviewing this expansion. I think it would be a really fun video coming from someone who's still pretty negative on Cyberpunk, and I'm extremely curious to see how they'll approach new content for this game after learning from their failures. I had no idea, but this project was apparently announced long ago under a different name and disappeared until now. It's the next game from the Persona 5 team, and low-key the biggest reveal of the event. The game itself has clear parallels to Persona, with its beautifully stylized interface design and combat system, but the setting here is full-on fantasy, and the real-time traversable environments are substantially larger and more detailed than Persona 5. Persona 6 is undoubtedly in development, but this game is almost as big of a deal for those into turn-based JRPGs. It's wild that this reemerged at an Xbox event, but it has since been confirmed for PlayStation. Nonetheless, a huge game, huge announcement, and I'm sure it will perform well with that Persona pedigree. I've decided to cluster these games together because I feel they occupy the same space. These are all what I would describe as B-tier releases, not necessarily in terms of their quality, but in their production value and profile. It's the kind of stuff that has defined Xbox for the past 5+ years. I don't have a problem with these types of games, and I actually think Sony is now sorely missing them in the absence of Japan's studio. The issue is instead when they're put in the forefront as big first-party games. These smaller games have a more niche appeal, they're not system sellers, and their quality level can really run the gamut. Sometimes you get a gem. It actually happened earlier this year with Hi-Fi Rush, which was like an oasis in the Xbox desert. But for every one of those, there's like 5 that languish on Game Pass when it comes to not only published games, but games that they secure the marketing partnership for, such as Back 4 Blood. I think that inconsistency really showed itself with these games in this showcase. South of Midnight was yet another one of these in-engine cutscene-only trailers that did little to elucidate the game, but appeared to have a decent amount of creativity and style with its fantasy bayou setting and cartoonish look. Then there's Clockwork Revolution, which represents the Game Pass fodder. It's embarrassingly similar to BioShock Infinite, and not just on a surface level with the setting and art style, but with the plot points, the character designs, and even the in-game posters. I'm sorry, but this game just looks like junk. Wish.com BioShock Infinite, and it's jarring to see this on stage alongside serious heavy hitters as a first-party Xbox game. Finally, there's Avowed, which I think reflects the more narrow appeal of some of these smaller profile games. Although New Vegas is lauded as one of the best games of all time, Obsidian is frankly a niche developer, and this game is even more niche than something like The Outer Worlds. Their work can also be pretty hit or miss depending on who you ask, and I hate to be shallow, but Avowed here looks like a game that could have existed 2 generations ago. I'm very aware that this has its own audience that is eagerly anticipating it, but it just feels like a missed opportunity to have Obsidian doing 2 projects that are both of more narrow appeal. I'm not trying to hate on smaller projects here, I'm just trying to say that having all these different, seemingly random games of wildly different perceived quality levels all on stage together makes it difficult to comprehend what an Xbox game is all about. Much to my surprise, this event included a hardware announcement, which is a new SKU for the Series S, black with 1TB of storage. As a digital-only console in a world where games are commonly in excess of 100GB, this was a desperately needed upgrade for the humble Series S, but the issue is that they're asking an extra $50 for it. Now, this is complete bullshit for 2 reasons. First off, I see the Series S go on sale either directly or by proxy via bundle deals all the time now, so that original $300 price point is now effectively lowered. Secondly, flash storage is so cheap right now. You can get a 1TB PCIe Gen 3 SSD, which is around the speed of what the series consoles use, for under $50, and as a systems manufacturer, Microsoft is obviously paying a fraction of that. I think the $50 upcharge is super rude and unnecessary. This should just be the new Series S from now on. I have to admit that I went into this Starfield dedicated second half of the event with a very grumpy, negative attitude, and I think I should elaborate on why. BGS and Bethesda, with the notable exception of id, have been in a rocky place for a minute, to the point where it may have facilitated the Microsoft acquisition. BGS really has a lot to prove here. 76 was an unmitigated disaster out of the gate, and while it's been turned around or whatever, it's still a stain on their reputation. Fallout 4 was the last real game, and it sometimes feels like it never existed, while Skyrim, Fallout 3, and even Oblivion continue to live rent-free in the general consciousness. Starfield always needed to be a redemption moment for them, but after it became an Xbox game, the stakes rose to stratospheric levels. It started to be viewed as the savior for Xbox. Then, after first hearing the name Starfield nearly a decade prior, we saw gameplay, and for me, it was a Halo Infinite 2020 moment. The game looked rough in every aspect. Poor visuals, erratic performance, and the combat looked like Cyberpunk 2077 at launch. It also seemed like with their design aspirations that they had not learned at all from their last two games and were setting themselves up for failure. What I saw was a game that had tons of procedurally generated barren environments, resource grinds, and Fallout 4 Radiant Quest-style infinite gameplay loops. It looked like the original release of No Man's Sky, literally at that quality level. Then came the announcement of a delay after a ballsy reveal of a specific release day in 2021. It gave the outward look of a game that was in crisis. I was ready for this to be another Cyberpunk-level failure, but that delay seems to have worked miracles, because what was shown in this presentation feels like a completely different game, one that is coming from a place of confidence rather than from desperation. Where do you even start with this presentation? I guess with the only real glaring negative, which is the visuals. They're a dramatic improvement over what was shown last year with a much better lighting model, but this really isn't a generational leap over Fallout 4, and looks far behind most every other AAA game, especially those that are current gen only. In fact, I might even go as far as to say that this looks worse than Fallout 4 did in its time. Clearly, this is not a game that is pushing graphics, but it is pushing tech, and it's doing so in ways that we've never seen to this extent. This is a complex, systems-driven game, with a dizzying amount of mechanics at play, and based off the ones they delve deep into, it's not shallow stuff, it's all quite substantial and used with regularity throughout the game. Beyond the claim of 1,000 planets, which itself isn't anything all that impressive to me, that's the real ambition here. There's like 3 games worth of mechanics. I mean, just look at how unnecessarily far they went with the ship mechanics, which is something that could have been pretty basic. There is a robust ship builder. You can recruit NPCs to your ship, many of which don't even appear to be companions. There's ship combat. You can dock and board ships, both in a friendly and adversarial context. You can steal ships and use them later, and you can find derelict ships, which is one of my favorite sci-fi tropes. One of the more interesting ones wasn't even mentioned outright. I just noticed it in the UI. It seems that there is some sort of smuggling system. They're properly simulating gravity. In low gravity, shooting combustion projectile weapons pushes you back, while energy weapons don't. Then they have all these crazy perks, reminiscent of the life paths in Cyberpunk, but infinitely more deep. One gives you parents who you can visit, while another gives you the adoring fan from Oblivion as a companion. It's silly stuff that was played for laughs in the presentation, but this is a crazy amount of work to make an entire companion character do all that dialogue just for a joke optional perk. Basically, what they've done here is make an immersive space simulator, the kind of complex game that people wanted out of Cyberpunk. But the crazy part is, that's not even the entire game. They seemed keen on making sure to convey that there is designed content here as well, just like any traditional BGS game. We're getting multiple non-procedurally generated planets that have densely populated cities, with them claiming that one of them is the largest ever in a BGS game. We're still getting lengthy side quests, those encounters that present themselves as you explore and unfold into a richer storyline. That's what I really come to a Bethesda game for, and the biggest question I have is how much of it is there. If they manage to deliver a full-size BGS game that also happens to have all the space simulator stuff and the 1,000 plus planet infinite gameplay loop on top of it, this really is going to be a game to behold, and a game that satisfies a lot of people. I just hope it's designed in a way that allows players to choose which of those systems they care about, rather than forcing them to grind things as part of the main quest progression. Because I already know that I have little interest in spending hours gathering resources and setting up outposts on barren planets. I still can't believe I'm saying this, but I think they really might pull this off, and given the scope, the ambition, and how bad it looked last year, that's astounding. Outside of some frame drops and inconsistent visual quality between the more bespoke and likely generated areas, this game is looking pretty polished, a quantum leap over last year. Hell, even the combat looks way better. I said in the past that Microsoft bought this as an exclusive rather than enabling it to exist, but now I feel like that ownership may have afforded them the luxury of the delay and gave them more resources. In a universe where a struggling Bethesda was still on its own, they may have been forced to ship this in a Cyberpunk-like state in 2022. Now, of course, this wouldn't be a big game without some controversy, and this time it was the statement from Todd that this will be a 30 FPS game on both series consoles. Console players have now become accustomed to at least having the option of a 60 FPS mode, and it doesn't help that, again, this game isn't a looker. We're looking at what is likely the first AAA CPU-heavy game in forever, and people aren't used to that because console CPUs have been so anemic until this generation. I think this is a CPU-bound game, and while the Zen 2 cores of the series consoles thrash the Jaguar cores of the Xbox One, they're roughly equivalent to a 3700X, which is a 4-year-old CPU at this point. I do agree with Todd that a consistent 30 FPS lock, which, by the way, will be breaking new ground for a BGS game at launch if true, is preferable to a wildly undulating unlocked frame rate. But I do think they could provide some options here. It sounds like a locked or nearly locked 40 FPS could be possible, which is a huge improvement over 30 and can be taken advantage of by 120Hz display owners. While it may not be a great experience now, including an unlocked mode would future-proof the game for when more powerful Xbox hardware eventually comes out. A lot of the reason we're seeing so many 60 FPS console games is because of the prolonged cross-gen transition, and now that we're leaving that, some games just aren't going to be able to do 60 if they're pushing the hardware, be it with cutting-edge visual features or with CPU-heavy systems. That aside, I think Phil Spencer was dead wrong in that interview. They have something special here, something that will dominate the conversation in gaming when it comes out, which an Xbox game has not done in forever. It's going to hurt PlayStation badly to not have this game, and it will move consoles, especially if it launches in a polished state and gets good reviews and word of mouth. This may also be a time when the Series S actually shines. $300 for a Starfield machine might be justifiable for some PlayStation owners who don't have PCs, and while it will probably be an inferior experience to Series X, you still get to play the game. It was proudly stated before the show that the first-party studios would refrain from CG trailers. While that's true and everything was in-engine, we have key offenders here like Fable and South of Midnight whose trailers did little more to show the game than a CG trailer would have. That shit needs to stop. We need more deep dive presentations like Starfield, or just raw gameplay cuts like what Ubisoft ended up doing with Star Wars Outlaws. Generally speaking though, this was a decent showing, with a reasonable length and good pacing, unlike Jeff Keighley's Summer Game Fest, which was an exercise in patience. No doubt it was a better show than PlayStation, but I'm still having issues with the direction of Xbox. Not to pick on it too much, but I'm sick of seeing games like Clockwork Revolution pushed as big exclusives, and I'm still not seeing a consistent flow from Xbox of AAA tentpole games. Fable is probably their next game at that quality level, and it doesn't seem like it's coming anytime soon. In the next 8 months, Sony has FF16, Spider-Man 2, and FF7R2. Those are heavy hitters, and while Starfield is arguably bigger than any of them, it's that cadence of big titles that Xbox is still sorely lacking. I also have to say that outside of the new Atlas title, no announcement here is shaking up the industry, and I'm wondering why they're not doing anything like that. With what's in their deck, Microsoft has the power to make some really cool stuff happen now. A Halo spin-off from id or a new Fallout from Obsidian immediately come to mind. Of course that stuff takes time to roll out, but even more simple cash grab type stuff is notably absent. Things like remakes and remasters. A simple New Vegas rebuild within the Fallout 4 engine would be an instant victory. As evidenced by Redfall, Microsoft has been taking a very hands-off approach with its developers. Many in the industry may view that as a benevolent thing, and Microsoft probably feels the same way, but it's not proving to be a winning formula. Sony's treatment of its studios may be a tad draconian compared to Microsoft's progressive developer utopia, but results are results, and it's part of the culture which gives the PlayStation first-party lineup an identity. Enough of the 4-player co-op Game Pass stuff. Put these guys on interesting projects, support artistry, enable things that couldn't have existed otherwise, and don't be afraid to step in if you see them struggling. For the most part, it just kind of feels like these things being owned by Microsoft has not added value or changed anything other than them not being available on PlayStation. It's as if there's no director for this ever-growing list of things under the Xbox umbrella, no culture. I do commend them on Starfield, though. I think that is one example where the game might have had to launch in a broken state if Bethesda didn't have the Microsoft safety net. I don't want to come off too negative here. Overall, this is the most hopeful I've felt about Xbox since Spencer took the lead from Mattrick. They still have years of work ahead of them before they can truly compete with what PlayStation is doing, but at the very least, with Starfield, the series consoles finally have a system seller.